My mom mocked me for years. Then I drove past her house in a luxury Mercedes. I remember the way her laugh used to echo through the kitchen, sharp and hollow, like it was designed to sting. She never missed a chance to point out my failures, my clumsy ambition, the way I always aimed too high and fell short. I can still feel the weight of her eyes on me, cold and dismissive, the ones that made a child feel invisible while everyone else in the room could see only her. My name is Leora Vance. I'm 38 now. The woman she made me into, silent, careful, calculating, was forged in those years of ridicule. I learned early that confrontation wasn't my armor, observation was. I remember sitting at the dining table at 16, scraping a bowl of cereal with a spoon, listening to her mock my ideas about college, about travel, about anything beyond the four walls she ruled. I nodded politely, swallowed the lump in my throat, and let her words sink in like tiny, deliberate cuts. I thought then I was just a clumsy girl. Later, I understood I was learning. She loved my younger brother Carter with a ferocity that scared me. Not that she loved him more, she worshipped him as though he were the only success she could ever claim. I watched her eyes light up when he smiled. I watched her praise his grades, his sports, even his sloppy little attempts at drawing. And I stayed quiet, out of habit, out of fear, and eventually out of a strange sense of strategy. I learned that surviving Mom's world meant disappearing into shadows. When I left for college, I thought distance would heal the wounds. It didn't. Phone calls would arrive once a month. Short, condescending. "Why don't you come home? We miss you," she'd say, and I'd hear the laughter of her friends in the background. She wanted me back, not to love me, but to prove her point. To remind me I was small, dependent beneath her. I stayed away longer than expected. I worked harder. I built my life piece by piece. Every achievement, quiet and invisible to her. There was a turning point, though. One I didn't fully realize until years later. It came when my first job in finance offered me a promotion to assistant director. Mom called that evening, like clockwork. And instead of congratulations, she said, "Don't get too proud, Leora. You'll always be the girl who stumbled over her shoelaces." Her voice had that sharp, familiar edge, that thin veneer of amusement covering contempt. I smiled anyway. I could hear her chuckling over the phone, imagining me humbled, the same way she always did. I hung up, heart racing, but not from anger. From clarity. I realized I didn't need her approval, but I could orchestrate a moment she'd never forget. Years passed. I climbed the corporate ladder, each step deliberate, careful, a response to the quiet mockery that had shaped me. I learned the value of patience, of control, of timing. Every small insult she'd thrown at me, every dismissive glance, became fuel I stored somewhere in my chest, cold and precise. The world I inhabited outside my childhood home was different. Here, I was respected, competent, and even admired. But inside, a quiet part of me remained the 16-year-old girl listening to her mother laugh at her dreams. That part was never gone. It was waiting. I bought my first luxury car on a crisp September morning, a Mercedes, black as obsidian, gleaming under the sun, a model that cost more than most people I knew would earn in a year. I remembered her words vividly. "You'll never own anything like that. You're too clumsy, too foolish, too me." The memory made the cold metal of the car feel heavier with satisfaction. I parked it in my apartment complex, ran my fingers along the smooth surface, and smiled quietly to myself. This wasn't vanity. This wasn't showboating. It was proof. Not just to her, but to the girl who had learned to hide, to survive, to strategize. When the day came to drive past her house, I felt something I hadn't expected. A rush of adrenaline mixed with serenity. I knew she would be home. I had seen the routine, memorized it like lines in a play I had been rehearsing for years in my mind. Her laugh, the one I hated and feared, would greet me before her eyes even landed on the car. I wanted to watch her try to fit the puzzle together. How had I arrived here? What had she missed? That tiny pause before realization. That was the moment I craved more than any applause, any accolade, any praise the world could give. As I turned the corner onto her street, memories came rushing back. I saw myself at 12, standing by the mailbox, holding a report card I had worked months to perfect, and she had laughed. "You'll never get anywhere with grades like those," she'd said, tossing it into the trash. I had cried quietly in my room that night, wondering if anyone would ever see me as I truly was. And now, nearly 26 years later, I was driving the proof past her very doorstep. The house came into view. The familiar brick, the manicured lawn, the rose bushes she had insisted I help prune despite my allergies. Everything so meticulously maintained, so normal, so her. I drove slowly, deliberately, the Mercedes gliding like a shadow over pavement, my pulse steady. And then I saw her, in the window. She was folding laundry, humming a tune that always grated on my nerves, blissfully unaware. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, heart thrumming in anticipation. This was not revenge, loud and violent. This was a quiet, intelligent recalibration of our history. She noticed me finally. Her eyes narrowed, her mouth twisted in recognition. For a moment she froze. Then the laugh came. Small at first, nervous, trying to convince herself it was nothing. "That's ridiculous," she said aloud, though to no one in particular. I saw her children, Carter included, peek at her from the side, confused by the sudden tension. I smiled softly, watching her scramble to understand. I didn't honk, I didn't shout, I didn't wave. I just drove past, slowly. Every second of the engine's hum was a pulse of control, a reminder that years of mockery were finally meeting their measured response. Her laughter cracked. I caught it from the corner of my eye as I passed the driveway, and it sounded different. Frightened, uncertain, incredulous. She couldn't process it. Her hands clutched the edge of the counter, fingers pressing into the wood. I drove past the mailbox, past the gate, the engine purring beneath me like a silent anthem. She opened the door to see me disappear down the street, the car gleaming, impossible, untouchable. And in that moment, the room she had ruled with ridicule for decades was empty of power, stripped down to a realization she couldn't deny. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was devastating. The Mercedes wasn't just a car, it was the symbol of years of effort, resilience, and quiet plotting. It was the proof that her words, her mockery, her attempts to diminish me had failed spectacularly. I didn't need to stop. I didn't need to gloat. I just drove past, letting her see it, letting her feel the slow, simmering truth. I could almost see her heartbeat in her eyes, that moment of comprehension stretching too long, too late. And as I turned the corner to leave her street, a small, unexpected thing happened. I realized the real satisfaction wasn't in her shock. It wasn't in the envy or the panic or the quick gasp she made when the car's reflection caught her in the window. It was in the quiet accumulation of years, the careful patience, the meticulous strategy. I had taken nothing illegal, nothing violent. I had simply arrived. I had simply shown up in the world I had built for myself, in a way she could not ignore. And that, more than the car, more than the money, more than the flashing metal and leather and speed, was my quiet victory. I didn't stop driving after passing her house. The engine purred beneath me like a contained heartbeat, steady and deliberate, as if it knew the quiet storm it had just unleashed. The streetlights blurred into long streaks as I rolled past familiar corners, but my mind was anchored on the window I'd glimpsed her through. Her face, pale with disbelief, had been the first confirmation that my years of silent endurance were beginning to tip the balance. And yet, as satisfying as that moment had been, a small, nagging unease had settled behind my ribs, sharp and persistent. Something wasn't aligning. I parked the Mercedes at the far end of the block and watched her house from a distance, hidden by the dark canopy of old oaks. The glow of lamps inside hinted at movement. Shadows shifting, laughter that sounded forced. My phone vibrated with messages, but I ignored them. This was no moment for distraction. My mind replayed every detail. Her initial recognition, the twitch at the corners of her mouth, the way her shoulders stiffened, that hesitation, that fraction of a second, told me she didn't just see the car. She was recalculating. She was thinking. And that meant the game had truly begun. The next morning brought a subtle but undeniable change. My mother's calls, once casual and mocking, became strategic. "Leora," she said, voice carefully neutral. "I heard you drove by yesterday. Is that true?" She was testing me, probing, but trying to disguise it as concern. I smiled at the phone, just enough to feel the thrill, though she couldn't see it. "It's true," I said softly. "I wanted to show you something I've worked for." I didn't explain further. She hesitated, the pause long enough to feel her uncertainty radiate through the line. Carter called later that day. His tone was measured, polite, almost too careful. "Leora, Mom's upset," he said, then paused as if deciding whether to continue. "I mean, she's confused. She wants to talk. About everything." I listened to the carefully chosen words, the subtle anxiety beneath them, and let a slow, deliberate silence stretch before I replied. "I'll think about it," I said. No urgency, no invitation, just the quiet signal that the control had shifted, and I was deciding the tempo. By the evening, curiosity gnawed at me. I found myself driving past her neighborhood again, this time slower, watching windows and doors. I noticed things I hadn't seen before. A series of small security cameras she'd installed, blinking red quietly behind the eaves. Her car, polished as if it had just been bought, and the way the curtains moved when she thought no one was looking. She had always curated appearances. But now, it struck me how meticulous and protective she'd become. For decades, she had mocked me for ambition, yet here she was, guarding her own little world with the same obsessive energy. It was ironic, almost poetic, and it made me realize just how deep the control had always run. I decided to take a calculated step further. I scheduled a meeting at a nearby cafe under the guise of a casual catch-up. She arrived, impeccably dressed, hair perfectly styled, with Carter trailing a few steps behind, offering a careful smile. She hugged me briefly, warm on the surface, but I could feel the tension coiling beneath. Her eyes searched mine, measuring, probing for weakness or intent. "Leora, you look different," she said, a statement that felt like a test. "I'm just older," I replied evenly, not giving her the satisfaction of enthusiasm. The conversation was civil, superficial even, until she reached for her purse. I noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she pulled out a photograph. Me, younger, in a school play, smiling at the camera, oblivious to her critique behind the scenes. "I found this the other day," she said. Her tone was casual, but I caught the way her lips tightened. "You always looked so happy, even then." There was an edge of guilt buried in the words, subtle, almost imperceptible. I didn't respond. I let the photograph sit between us on the table. Let it become a silent accusation. After that meeting, things shifted quickly. Invitations arrived. Birthday dinners, holiday gatherings, casual brunches, carefully worded to appear spontaneous. I accepted none. Each invite was a test, and I could see the frustration grow through whispered phone calls between Carter and her. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had spent decades teaching me to measure every action, to anticipate consequences, to understand the subtle dynamics of power. Now, she was experiencing her own lesson in patience and restraint. Then came the discovery that unsettled me more than anything. A mutual friend, someone who had stayed close to both of us, mentioned a series of emails my mother had written over the years. Not to me, not to anyone directly, but a draft folder on her cloud account, full of long, detailed notes cataloging my supposed failures, mistakes, and lessons to teach me. I felt a chill as I read fragments she'd accidentally shared. "Leora doesn't understand consequence. She never will. I must guide her. I must correct her." The language was familiar, terrifying in its precision. She hadn't just mocked me. She had obsessed over me. Every move I made had been anticipated. Every misstep catalogued. The realization hit me. Her mockery had always been a mechanism, a control tactic disguised as humor. The power I thought I wielded by driving past her house, by showing success, was only partial. She had prepared for this eventuality in ways subtle enough to remain hidden. And suddenly, the stakes were higher. My quiet victory wasn't guaranteed. It was now a game of maneuvering, timing, and psychological endurance. I began to notice other oddities. Packages arrived at my apartment, small, anonymous, meant to unsettle. Notes slipped under my door, typed but unsigned. Reminders of past humiliations, veiled suggestions that my achievements were unearned. Whoever was behind it knew enough to strike fear, not outrage, and it unnerved me more than I expected. My mind raced, but I forced control. Panic had no place here. Observation did. Patience did. I couldn't act without knowing all variables. One afternoon, I found myself at a private auction, a place I had never considered entering. A piece of art I had long admired appeared unexpectedly, listed at a price that felt deliberate, almost teasing. As I examined it, a subtle tension entered the room. I sensed someone watching, a familiar presence, just outside my line of sight. It was unnerving. The realization came slowly but sharply. She knew where I went, what I did, perhaps even who I associated with. Every attempt to reclaim autonomy was now layered with the awareness of her surveillance. The next weeks were a chess match of small gestures and observations. She hosted a brunch, the kind she knew I couldn't ignore for social appearances. I attended quietly, sitting at the edge of the room, observing every expression, every glance. Carter tried to draw me into conversations, subtle probes, almost pleading. Mom really wants to fix things? Just talk. I nodded politely, keeping my responses measured, each word a deliberate barrier. I could feel her eyes on me, calculating, weighing. She wasn't mocking me in front of others, not yet, but her control tactics had evolved. Her weapon now was silence, insinuation, and curiosity. And then came the moment that changed everything. I overheard a conversation between her and a family lawyer. Thin voices, hurried, tinged with panic. She's unpredictable. I don't know how she figured it out so quickly. I caught snippets as I moved past the doorway, pretending to search for a menu item. We need to reassess the estate, the assets, everything. My heart skipped. Estate, assets. My mind traced possibilities. Her control, her obsession, her mockery had always included hidden leverage, contingencies she thought I didn't see. But now, she was scrambling. For the first time in decades, she was unsteady. It was a revelation that reframed everything. The Mercedes, the silent drive past her house, the careful timing, all of it was not the end. It was the opening move in a far larger game. A game she hadn't expected me to understand until this very moment. And yet, the more I considered it, the more I realized that her panic, her whispered urgency, was proof that I was finally capable of unsettling her. That fear, that tiny fissure in her composure, was more potent than years of mockery ever had been. I left the brunch without a word, my mind spinning with calculations. I drove past her street again, slower this time, almost ritualistically, feeling the weight of each observation. Windows flickered with light, shadows moved, and I imagined her pacing, trying to make sense of what she couldn't see fully. The sense of suspense, the quiet tension, was intoxicating. I knew that the next move, mine or hers, would define everything. And then I noticed something subtle, almost absurdly mundane, but it hit me like a hammer. A delivery truck pulling up to her garage. Not unusual, except the driver seemed hesitant, checking his clipboard nervously. My mother appeared at the door, her posture rigid, hands pressed to her sides, watching him as if the world itself depended on that moment. There was an urgency in her glance, a silent conversation that didn't include me. The realization struck hard. She wasn't just reacting to my success. She was mobilizing, orchestrating, planning, scrambling to regain advantage. I felt a thrill that was equal parts fear and exhilaration. The game had shifted. The stakes were no longer about a single luxury car, a single moment of satisfaction. They were about legacy, power, and influence. Everything I thought I had secured was now layered with complexity I hadn't anticipated. And yet, there was an undeniable sense of clarity that came with it. She had underestimated me, and that was the single variable that could change everything. I drove home that night, the Mercedes gliding over familiar streets, my mind replaying every detail. I knew the next days would be decisive. Though I had no certainty about outcomes, I could feel the tension coiling in my chest, sharp and electric, as if the world itself was holding its breath. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the delicate balance of power could snap. But one right observation, one perfectly timed response, and the quiet satisfaction I had tasted would multiply beyond imagination. The following morning, I received a note slipped under my apartment door, typed, precise, almost taunting, "You think you've arrived, but some things are not yet yours to command." I stared at the words, heart steady, pulse controlled, a small smile curling at my lips. The first act was complete. The second act had begun, and I knew, without doubt, that what came next would demand everything I had learned, every ounce of patience, every calculation, every quiet strategy accumulated over decades. The note under my door had been the first signal, but it wasn't enough. I needed to see, to hear, to feel the subtle shifts that would tell me she had truly realized I was no longer the child she could manipulate. I waited, patient, letting the day unfold with deliberate slowness. Calls came, carefully scripted. Cautious inquiries about meetings, lunches, casual invitations. I declined all, every single one, and let the silence stretch. The absence of my presence was louder than any confrontation. I could feel the tension radiating through her carefully curated world, and it was intoxicating. That evening, I returned to her street. The Mercedes hummed quietly beneath me. I parked at a distance, leaning back in the seat, observing. Inside her house, lights flickered on and off, shadows moving behind curtains. I saw Carter pacing, a phone pressed to his ear, voice low, insistent. And then she appeared at the front window, standing perfectly still, eyes searching, trying to discern what I had learned, what I knew, and perhaps what I planned next. I let my gaze linger on her. Calm, measured, an unspoken signal. I had arrived in full. The next morning, I received an email. No subject line, just a single sentence. Meet me tonight, alone. I felt a rush of clarity, sharp and precise. She had decided to act, but so had I. I agreed, carefully choosing a location that offered neutrality but allowed me full observation. A small, dimly lit restaurant tucked away from familiar streets. I arrived first, letting the seat opposite me remain empty just long enough to feel the gravity of anticipation. When she entered, she moved with the same elegance and control she had always exhibited. But there was something different, a hesitation beneath the polish, a subtle tremor of uncertainty. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Leora," she said softly, voice measured, "You've changed." I returned the greeting with an even quiet nod. "I suppose I have." We ordered nothing at first, letting silence stretch like a taut wire between us. The unspoken history hovered. Decades of mockery, derision, subtle emotional sabotage. Every word and glance catalogued. Wait. Then she spoke. Finally. Cautiously. Almost whispering, I didn't expect you to." She faltered. The words were heavy, unformed. The first crack in a facade that had seemed unbreakable. I waited, letting the silence press, giving her space to acknowledge the depth of what she had underestimated. I realized then that the power had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. She was seeing me now, fully, as someone separate, someone formidable, someone who could not be dismissed or controlled. I leaned forward, voice soft, deliberate. "It's not about the car, Mom. It never was." Her eyes flicked up, a flash of recognition passing through them. The luxury, the quiet drive past her house, the patience. It had all been a demonstration, yes, but also a statement. I had claimed agency in a world that she had spent decades trying to constrain. I saw a tension ripple across her shoulders. She knew it. She felt it. And for the first time, she realized that mockery, humiliation, and manipulation were no longer sufficient. Carter's presence lingered in her peripheral, but he was silent, watching the dynamic unfold without interference. My mother's hands twitched, small, nervous motions that betrayed her usual composure. I felt the weight of years compress into a single moment, all the times she had dismissed me, belittled me, laughed at my dreams. Now, in the quiet of a dim restaurant, she was confronted not with argument, but with fact. She had underestimated the depth of patience, the intelligence, the subtlety with which I had been preparing. Then she spoke, almost inaudibly. I thought I could guide you. I thought I could manage it all." The confession wasn't dramatic, not at all. It was a quiet unraveling. Every carefully curated insult, every attempt to control, every whispered critique had been a mechanism to contain me, to ensure she maintained leverage. And now, the leverage was gone. It was not through confrontation, not through anger, not through visible rebellion, but through quiet, controlled self-possession. I nodded, voice calm, measured. "And you did," I said, "for a long time, but you miscalculated." I let the words settle between us, letting them carry the weight of every past dismissal. She exhaled sharply, almost as if recognizing the finality of a long, unspoken truth. I watched the tension drain from her posture, replaced with the quiet understanding that I was no longer the person she could affect with sarcasm or ridicule. The Mercedes, the patience, the strategic absence, it had all been preparation for this precise shift. We didn't argue. We didn't fight. There was no need. The power dynamic had inverted with subtlety and precision, and silence now was a language that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. My mother sat back, eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing the implications of the revelation. I allowed a small smile, not triumphant, but controlled, intentional. It was not gloating. It was acknowledgement. We had reached a point of understanding, and I had arrived fully as myself. Later, as I drove away, the night cool and clear, I realized the final twist had not been in my action, but in her reaction. Her subtle panic over assets, her hastily whispered consultations, the carefully orchestrated communications, they all signaled awareness, but also vulnerability. She had spent years believing she could predict, manipulate, and guide. But in trying to constrain me, she had inadvertently demonstrated the very path I needed to claim independence and respect. Days passed, with small, careful interactions. She reached out again, carefully, tentatively, with invitations that seemed casual but carried weight. I chose which to accept, which to ignore. Every decision reinforced boundaries, delineated control, and every choice was made with the knowledge that intelligence, patience, and observation were more powerful than any overt act of revenge or confrontation. Then came the final, quiet confirmation, a family gathering, meant to flaunt status, to remind me of her sphere of influence. I attended, arriving in the Mercedes, understated but unmistakable. Eyes turned, whispers began, and I allowed myself the luxury of quiet observation. She looked at me, truly looked, for the first time in decades, and I saw recognition in her expression, a mixture of disbelief, apprehension, and eventually respect. It was subtle, but it was undeniable. The balance had shifted, without spectacle, but irrevocably. In that moment, I understood something fundamental. Revenge had never been about humiliation. It had been about reclaiming space, claiming respect, and asserting agency. The laughter, the snide remarks, the attempts to control, they no longer held sway over me. I had moved past them, past her judgments, past the patterns that had shaped my early life. And as I sat quietly, observing her trying to reconcile her perception of me with reality, I felt a peace I hadn't known before. I left that night with calm certainty. The Mercedes carried me through familiar streets, lights reflecting on the hood like tiny constellations. I had not sought to crush, to gloat, or to confront. I had chosen precision, timing, and control. And the result was more satisfying than any dramatic display could have been. The quiet realization of her miscalculation, her subtle panic, and the ultimate recognition of my autonomy. It was all I needed. And as I settled into the night, a thought lingered. How often do we allow the expectations of others to define us? And what would it feel like to step fully into the space they tried to deny us? The answer, I realized, was profound and simple. Freedom is quiet. Empowerment is deliberate. Respect is earned, not demanded. So, I ask you, listening now, where have you allowed someone else's mockery or judgment to define your path? What small, deliberate steps could you take to reclaim it? Every day offers a choice. Pause, observe, move with intention, and sometimes the quietest actions speak the loudest. I'd love to hear where you are listening from. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know your story. If this resonated, please like, subscribe, and follow for more stories where quiet strength meets careful strategy. And remember, control your pace. Observe the game. Quiet persistence outlasts mockery. Strength is often subtle, and your power is in choosing when and how to show it.